A war so short, you could start it, end it, and still have time to finish your morning coffee. A conflict so brief, it didn't even last a full episode of your favorite TV show. Yet, it was very real. It was fought between one of the most powerful empires in human history, the British Empire, and a tiny island nation off the coast of East Africa called Zanzibar. The entire war lasted just 38 minutes. Yes, you heard that right. Not 38 hours, not 38 days, 38 minutes. And within that short time, an empire's military crushed a rebellion, destroyed a palace, sank ships, and changed the course of the region's history forever. But how could such a thing even happen? What could possibly lead to a war that short, yet that destructive? To understand this strange moment in time, we have to go back to the late 19th century, the age of empire, when the world was being carved up by European powers. In Africa, Britain, France, and Germany were expanding their territories rapidly, drawing borders on maps that often ignored the people who lived there. Zanzibar, a small but wealthy island off today's Tanzania, was one of the key prizes of the Indian Ocean. Known for its spice trade, ivory markets, and deep-water ports that connected Africa, Arabia, and India. For centuries, Zanzibar had been ruled by powerful Arab sultans, and its location made it a crossroads of cultures: Arab, African, Indian, and European. By the 1890s, however, Britain had already extended its influence over the island, forcing it to sign treaties that gave the empire control over trade and foreign policy. But in 1896, everything changed, all because of a death. When the ruling Sultan, Hamad bin Thuwaini, suddenly died under mysterious circumstances. A political crisis exploded overnight. Many believed he had been poisoned. And within hours, his ambitious cousin Khalid bin Barghash took over the royal palace, declared himself the new sultan, and raised his own flag above the city. The British government, however, had other ideas. They did not recognize Khalid as ruler, and they wanted him gone immediately. Over the next 2 days, the standoff between Britain and Khalid's forces escalated dangerously. Gunboats arrived in the harbor. Cannons were loaded, and a deadly ultimatum was issued. On the morning of August 27, 1896, as the sun rose over the harbor of Zanzibar, one of the strangest and shortest wars in human history was about to begin. A war that would last less than an hour, yet leave hundreds dead, a palace in ruins, and an empire even more powerful than before. By the late 19th century, the world was dominated by empires. The British flag flew over nearly 1/4 of the planet's land. And the phrase, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," wasn't just poetic, it was almost literally true. From India to Egypt, from Australia to South Africa, Britain's power stretched across continents. Trade routes were guarded by its mighty navy, and every island or port in the Indian Ocean carried some strategic importance. Zanzibar was one of those places, small, tropical, and seemingly insignificant, but in truth, a jewel at the crossroads of global commerce. For centuries, Zanzibar had been a center of the spice trade. Cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon filled the island's air with a sweet, heavy scent, and European merchants had long sought its bounty. But spices weren't the only source of wealth. Zanzibar was also one of East Africa's most active slave markets, supplying human labor to the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. By the late 1800s, the British Empire, having abolished the slave trade decades earlier, wanted to stamp out the practice completely. Their moral mission conveniently aligned with their political interests. Ending the slave trade also meant extending British control over East Africa's economy. At this time, The Sultanate of Zanzibar was ruled by Arab elites of Omani descent. For generations, they had governed from their grand palace overlooking the harbor of Stone Town, their rule backed by wealth and maritime influence. But while the Sultan held the title of ruler, British advisors controlled much of the real power, including foreign policy, finance, and even succession decisions. Zanzibar was officially independent, but in practice, it existed in the shadow of the British Empire. In 1890, the World-and-Zanzibar Treaty between Britain and Germany formalized that influence. Germany gained control of mainland Tanzania, while Zanzibar fell firmly within Britain's sphere. From then on, no sultan could ascend the throne without the approval of the British consul. This arrangement kept the island stable, at least for a while. The reigning sultan in 1896, Hamad bin Thuwaini, was a cooperative ally of Britain. He accepted their authority, respected their presence, and ensured that British interests were protected. Under his rule, Zanzibar's relationship with the empire was peaceful, if unequal. But on the morning of August 25, 1896, that peace was shattered. Sultan Hamad was found dead inside his palace. The news spread rapidly through Stone Town's narrow, sunlit streets. Whispers filled the air. Some said he had died of natural causes, others believed he had been poisoned. Before the British consul could act, Hamad's cousin, Khalid bin Barghash, made his move. He marched into the palace with hundreds of armed supporters, claimed the throne, and hoisted his royal flag above the palace roof. It was an audacious act. Khalid knew Britain would oppose him, but he also knew that his claim had local support. Many Zanzibaris saw him as the rightful heir, a man who could restore independence and push back against British interference. In the palace courtyard, his guards stood ready with rifles and cannons. Some old and rusted, but loaded nonetheless. When the British consul, Basil Cave, learned of Khalid's coup, he immediately sent a message demanding that Khalid step down and leave the palace. Khalid ignored it. Instead, he gathered his men, fortified the palace, and ordered his artillery to be aimed toward the harbor. From the palace balcony, he could see British warships already anchored. Offshore, HMS St. George, HMS Philomel, and HMS Thrush, their guns silently watching the city. The tension was electric. Inside the palace, the new sultan was confident. He believed that Britain would hesitate to attack, fearing diplomatic backlash or loss of trade. But the British Empire was not known for hesitation. Every hour that passed made war more likely. Zanzibar, once the spice island, was now on the brink of fire and smoke. The marketplace continued to buzz with activity, but people could sense that something terrible was coming. And as British officers calculated firing ranges and local soldiers checked their weapons, the countdown to the shortest war in history had already begun. As the sun rose over the harbor of Zanzibar on August 26, 1896, the calm of the island was deceiving. The turquoise waters shimmered under the morning light, merchants shouted in the market, and the aroma of cloves drifted through Stone Town's narrow alleys. Yet behind the palace walls, tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sultan Khalid bin Barghash had declared himself ruler less than a day earlier, and the British Empire, the most formidable power on earth, was already preparing to challenge him. Inside the British consulate, Basil Cave, the acting consul, sat at his desk surrounded by telegrams and reports. His orders from London were clear. Britain would not recognize Khalid's rule without prior approval. Cave knew that any hesitation might embolden the new sultan, and so he decided to act swiftly. He sent a formal message to the palace, demanding that Khalid step down immediately and leave the royal compound. The letter was polite but firm, It left no room for negotiation. When Khalid read the message, he reportedly smiled. He had no intention of surrendering. To him, the throne was his by birthright. He believed that the British, for all their power, would not dare to bombard a royal palace in the heart of a city filled with civilians and foreign traders. He was wrong. Throughout the day, both sides prepared for what was to come. From the palace courtyard, the sounds of hammering and shouting echoed as Khalid's men reinforced gates and positioned cannons along the sea-facing walls. Most of the weapons dated back decades, rusty, mismatched, and unreliable, but they were all that he had. Around 800 men, including palace guards and loyal civilians, took up arms to defend their sultan. The royal yacht, HHS Glasgow, was anchored in the harbor, armed with a few small cannons and ready to support the defense. In contrast, the British preparations were precise and overwhelming. By the afternoon, 3 Royal Navy warships, HMS St. George, HMS Thrush, and HMS Philomel, had maneuvered into firing positions facing the palace. The flagship, St. George, was a cruiser armed with massive naval guns capable of leveling buildings within minutes. Marines and sailors were deployed ashore to protect the British consulate and the customs house. The harbor, once peaceful, now resembled a powder keg waiting for a spark. Local residents watched nervously from balconies as the ships' cannons turned toward the city. Word spread quickly through the markets. The British were going to attack. Shops closed early, families fled inland, and the normally bustling waterfront fell silent. By evening, Basil Cave sent his second message, an ultimatum. It stated that unless Sultan Khalid lowered his flag and left the palace by 9 a.m. the next morning, the British forces would open fire. The message was direct, final, and cold. When Khalid received it, he gathered his advisors for an emergency meeting inside the palace hall. The air was thick with fear and bravado. Some urged him to negotiate. Others insisted he stand his ground. The Sultan's pride won the debate. He refused to submit to foreign demands. "I will not surrender my grandfather's throne," he declared, and ordered his men to hold their positions. The royal flag of Zanzibar continued to wave above the palace, a red banner of defiance. Night fell over the island, cloaking the harbor. In darkness, from the decks of the British warships, officers watched the flickering lights of the palace through their binoculars. They could hear the faint echo of drums and voices carrying across the water. The final countdown had begun. Sailors prepared ammunition, gunners checked their aim, and officers synchronized their watches to the minute. At the British consulate, Cave sent one last telegram to London confirming that the Sultan had refused to step down. The reply from the Foreign Office came swiftly. "You are authorized to take such action as you may consider necessary." That night, Khalid's palace stood illuminated by hundreds of oil lamps, as if trying to hold back the inevitable dawn. He spent the final hours pacing the marble corridors, praying and issuing last-minute orders. Outside, his soldiers, poorly trained and armed, waited anxiously, some clutching outdated rifles, others holding spears. Few of them truly understood what kind of firepower they were about to face. As the first light of morning touched the horizon, the sea was calm, almost unnaturally so. The British ships floated silently, their cannons aimed and ready. The clock struck 8:55 a.m., just 5 minutes left. From the palace tower, the flag of Sultan Khalid still fluttered defiantly in the wind. Basil Cave gave his final signal. If the flag remained by 9 o'clock, the attack would begin. And then, as the clock ticked closer to 9, an uneasy stillness gripped the harbor, a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. No one spoke. No one moved. At 9:02 a.m., the first shell was fired. The war, the shortest in human history, had begun. At exactly 9:02 a.m. on the morning of August 27, 1896, the first thunderous boom shattered the silence of Zanzibar's harbor. A shell fired from HMS Thrush streaked through the humid air and smashed into the walls of the Sultan's palace. Within seconds, the calm turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean reflected columns of black smoke and bursts of flame. The shortest war in history had begun. Inside the palace, panic erupted. The first explosion sent fragments of stone and glass flying through the halls. Guards scrambled for cover, shouting orders that were lost beneath the roar of naval guns. The ornate wooden doors, carved with Arabic calligraphy, splintered as debris rained down. Women and children screamed as the roof shook from the second impact. The palace, a symbol of royal authority for generations, was being torn apart, brick by brick. From the harbor, the British bombardment was relentless. The ships HMS St. George, HMS Philomel, and HMS Thrush fired in perfect coordination, their gunners working with mechanical precision. The first salvo destroyed the palace's main defenses. The second targeted the Sultan's artillery positions. Cannons on the palace roof tried to return fire, but most were outdated and poorly mounted. A few shots splashed harmlessly into the water, while others fell short. The British sailors, shielded behind steel plating, suffered almost no damage in return. Within minutes, the royal yacht HHS Glasgow, anchored near the palace, joined the fight, its small guns barking defiantly toward the British fleet. It was a brave but futile gesture. At 9:05, HMS Thrush turned its guns toward the yacht and fired. One shell struck the hull near the waterline, another hit the deck, igniting an explosion. The Glasgow listed heavily to one side, burning fiercely. By 9:10, it sank beneath the waves, taking dozens of crew members with it. As smoke thickened over Stone Town, the civilians who had not yet fled began running through the narrow alleys, seeking shelter. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, mingling with the scent of spices and salt from the sea. The once lively marketplace was now deserted, its stalls overturned, fruits and baskets scattered across the cobblestones. The sound of distant explosions echoed like thunder through the old coral stone buildings. Back at the palace, chaos reigned. Sultan Khalid's men tried desperately to hold their positions, firing from windows and towers, but every return volley was met with a storm of shells. One by one, the palace cannons were silenced. The British naval fire was astonishingly accurate. Each impact tore away another piece of the Sultan's pride. The clock on the palace wall stopped ticking when a shell struck the tower directly, freezing time forever at that fateful moment. By 9:15 a.m., parts of the palace were engulfed in flames. The roof collapsed, sending a cloud of dust and smoke rising high into the sky. Hundreds of defenders were dead or wounded. Many jumped into the harbor, trying to swim for safety, only to be pulled under by the wreckage or hit by stray bullets. The Sultan, realizing the battle was lost, fled through a back door, accompanied by a few loyal guards. He ran across the gardens and into the streets, heading toward the German consulate, which stood just a few hundred meters away. The British had strict orders not to fire on foreign diplomatic buildings, and the Germans, eager to defy their imperial rivals, opened their gates. Khalid slipped inside and disappeared from British reach. But the guns did not stop. Immediately, the bombardment continued for several more minutes to ensure total destruction of the palace and its defenses. At 9:35 a.m., the last shots echoed across the harbor. By 9:40 a.m., just 38 minutes after it began, the order to cease fire was given. Silence returned to Zanzibar, an eerie, heavy silence broken only by the crackling of burning wood and the distant cries of the wounded. When the smoke cleared, the scale of the devastation became clear. The palace complex was reduced to rubble, its once magnificent marble floors buried under ashes and twisted beams. The royal harem, the armory, and the throne room were gone. Fires burned for hours, sending plumes of dark smoke into the sky that could be seen from miles away. British Marines landed shortly after, moving cautiously through the ruins. They encountered little resistance. The few remaining defenders surrendered immediately, many too injured or terrified to fight. Doctors and sailors began assisting local residents caught in the crossfire. By mid-morning, the Union Jack was raised over the palace grounds. The war was over. The human cost, however, was shocking. Roughly 500 Zanzibaris were killed or wounded, soldiers, servants, and civilians alike. On the British side, there was just one sailor injured. The disparity was staggering, a brutal reminder of how uneven the battle had been. In less than an hour, the might of an empire had crushed an entire rebellion. As the British ships lowered their guns and the smoke drifted out to sea, the island seemed frozen in disbelief. The people of Zanzibar had witnessed history's shortest war, and one of its most decisive. The palace, once the heart of royal power, now stood as a blackened ruin against the bright African sun. The Sultan was gone, the throne empty, and the empire victorious. The clock read 9:40 a.m. The war had lasted only 38 minutes, shorter than the time it takes to prepare a meal, yet long enough to end a dynasty and alter the future of an entire nation. The Battle of Zanzibar was over. But the consequences of those 38 minutes were only just beginning. When the guns fell silent and the last echoes faded across the harbor, the island of Zanzibar lay in ruins. The acrid scent of smoke hung heavy in the air. What had once been a gleaming palace of marble and coral stone was now nothing more than a scorched skeleton, its walls charred and crumbling, its gardens trampled and littered with fragments of brass and bone. The sound of waves returned to the shoreline, gentle and indifferent, as if mocking the chaos that had just unfolded. For those who survived, the memory of that morning would never fade. 38 minutes that changed everything. Sultan Khalid bin Barghash, who had fled the palace as it burned, found temporary refuge inside the German consulate. Guards at the gate refused to allow British soldiers to enter, invoking international law to protect him. Furious but bound by diplomatic protocol, the British could do nothing but surround the area. Khalid remained hidden there for days, watching from behind the iron bars of the consulate's windows as British Marines patrolled the streets outside. Finally, under the cover of night, German officials smuggled him out through the back, disguised and escorted to a small boat. He crossed the water to German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, where he would live in exile. Years later, when the First World War began, he was captured by British forces once again and exiled farther away to Seychelles and later St. Helena, the same island where Napoleon had been imprisoned a century before. He would never rule Zanzibar again. The British, wasting no time, moved swiftly to restore order. Within hours, they installed Hamad bin Muhammad, a distant relative of the previous sultan and someone more compliant to their interests, as the new ruler. The ceremony was brief, quiet, and entirely symbolic. Hamad took the throne under the watchful eyes of British officers, his rule dependent on their approval. Zanzibar, from that moment onward, was no longer a truly independent kingdom. It became a British protectorate, its fate tied completely to the empire's colonial administration in East Africa. Under Sultan Hamad, the British began to reshape Zanzibar according to their vision. They abolished the slave trade, something they had long demanded from the sultans, but could never fully enforce until now. Slave markets were closed, and former slaves were promised freedom, though many remained trapped in poverty and dependence. British advisors established control over the island's finances, military, and foreign policy. The royal family became more of a ceremonial relic than a seat of power. For the people of Zanzibar, life after the war was a mixture of relief and resentment. Some were thankful the fighting had ended quickly, others mourned the hundreds of lives lost for what seemed like nothing. In the streets of Stone Town, the destruction was visible everywhere. The palace complex was reduced to ashes, and nearby homes bore the marks of cannon fire. Fishermen hauled charred debris from the harbor, pieces of the sunken royal yacht Glasgow, splintered planks, fragments of weapons. For weeks, the sea washed ashore reminders of that brief but devastating mourning. Internationally, the Anglo-Zanzibar War drew attention, not because of its size or importance, but because of its absurd brevity. Newspapers in London and across Europe carried headlines describing the 38-minute war. Some wrote about it with amusement, others with unease. It was, to the public, both a curiosity and a warning, a sign of the overwhelming dominance of modern naval power and the helplessness of smaller states caught under imperial control. For Britain, it was another demonstration of efficiency and authority. For Zanzibar, it marked the end of an era. In the years that followed, Zanzibar remained a quiet outpost of the British Empire. Trade continued, clothes, ivory, and spices, but always under British supervision. Generations grew up hearing stories of the war that lasted less than an hour, though most would speak of it with sadness rather than pride. The island's cultural life endured, blending African, Arab, and Indian traditions, but the spirit of independence had been dimmed. The palace ruins were eventually cleared away, and a new building was erected in their place, a museum called the House of Wonders, filled with relics and reminders of a vanished royal age. Yet beneath the polished exhibits and faded photographs lingered the ghost of that morning, the moment when the British Empire proved how easily it could erase a kingdom. Historians today look back on the Anglo-Zanzibar War as a strange and tragic symbol of the colonial world. It was not a grand battle between equals. It was a brief, brutal assertion of dominance. A clash not of armies, but of eras, the old world of sultans and palaces crushed by the iron and steam of empire. And though it lasted only 38 minutes, its consequences stretched for decades. It transformed Zanzibar from a sovereign island into another cog in the machinery of empire. It ended the line of independent sultans. It extinguished, in one morning, a tradition of rule that had lasted for centuries. The cannons fell silent long ago, but the echoes of that morning still whisper through the narrow streets of Stone Town. They speak of pride and defiance, of fire and loss, of a moment when history paused, just long enough to remind the world that power, no matter how absolute, always comes at a cost. Today, more than a century later, the Anglo-Zanzibar War is remembered not for its glory, but for its brevity. 38 minutes, that's all it took for one empire to destroy a kingdom. No drawn-out campaigns, no long sieges, no heroic tales of resistance. Just a few welling shells, a flag lowered from a burning palace, and an empire reaffirmed its dominance over the world. But behind the statistics and the odd record of the shortest war in history lies a deeper story, one of arrogance, power, and the fragile nature of sovereignty. It reminds us that history isn't always written by the length of battles, but by the impact they leave behind. For Zanzibar, Those 38 minutes were more than an entry in a history book. They marked the end of an age, the moment when the dream of independence vanished under the shadow of the Union Jack. Standing in Stone Town today, it's hard to imagine that such violence once tore through this tranquil island. The narrow lanes are filled again with the scent of spices and the call of merchants. Tourists wander past the waterfront, taking photos of the House of Wonders and the old fort, unaware that the ground beneath their feet once shook with explosions. The harbor, calm and blue, gives no hint of the fire and smoke that once rose from its waters. Yet if you look closely, you can still see traces of that morning, the bullet holes preserved in old coral stone walls, the fading photographs in the museum, the local stories whispered by guides who know every corner of the island. They tell of a palace that vanished in less than an hour, of a sultan who refused to bow, and of an empire that proved its will through sheer destruction. It is a story easy to overlook, yet impossible to erase. The 38-minute war may seem like a footnote in the grand narrative of history, but in those brief moments, the world saw a reflection of something much larger, the imbalance of power that defined the age of empire. One side fought with outdated cannons and pride, the other with steel warships and discipline. It was not a contest between equals, but between centuries. The past colliding with the future. And the future, cold and unrelenting, won. History often glorifies victory, but there was no glory in Zanzibar's fall. Only silence after the gunfire, and the quiet submission of a people who had little choice. It was a warning, too, that power without mercy can flatten nations in moments, and that arrogance disguised as civilization can destroy what it claims to protect. In the grand halls of the British Admiralty, the war was soon forgotten, recorded merely as an efficient operation, a minor note in colonial reports. But on the island itself, the memory lingered, passed down in stories told by grandparents to children, about the morning when thunder came from the sea and the sky turned black with smoke. Today, Zanzibar stands free again, its people shaping their own future. The empire that once ruled it has long faded into history. Yet the story of the 38-minute war endures as a reminder that every act of conquest, no matter how swift, leaves behind scars deeper than the eye can see. It teaches us that time does not measure the importance of events, meaning does. 38 minutes were enough to change the destiny of a nation, to end a dynasty, and to reveal, once again, the terrible speed with which human pride can turn to destruction. As the waves lapped gently against the harbor walls where the palace once stood, the island has reclaimed its peace. The war that lasted less than an hour is now a whisper, carried by the sea breeze, a forgotten war, remembered only by those who still listen closely to the echoes of history. And perhaps that is the lesson it leaves us, that even the smallest stories, the briefest wars, and the quietest moments can hold truths greater than the empires that tried to erase them.